All right, everybody. So obviously we talked about core training last week. This week we're going to continue that theme and talk about what we call the Sling systems. So the year is 1988. Crocodile Dundee 2, a movie that I've never seen, just hit the big screen. And pork chops are really only 40 cents per pound. On top of this, our friend Serge Grakovetsky wrote his theory on human motion called the Spinal Engine. And this was a pretty big change for the industry. Definitely pretty revolutionary. And after reading this article that I read in order to make these couple blogs this week and the past week, I'm definitely fascinated by rotation and these sling systems, and I'm really excited to start incorporating this into my programming for my clients.
Yeah, definitely. I agree. The article first off, it was a lengthy article, but
Definitely lengthy article.
It definitely was deep in detail and it covered a lot of topics. But this topic, talking about the spinal engine, again, Grakovetsky developed this theory when he actually realized that quadruple amputees could walk on the bones of the bases of their pelvis. So they did this through spinal rotation and the muscle systems around that lumbopelvic region. He realized that quadruple amputees can walk on the bones at the bases of their pelvises, and they were able to do this through spinal rotation and the muscle systems around that lumbopelvic region. This, like in general, might just be the base of human movement.
Right.
So from this, Grakovetsky believed that the idea of spinal rotation is the base of human movement, and just that the limbs merely amplify the movement that originates from the musculature in the spine and trunk.
Yeah, and you can kind of picture it too. You know, if you've ever seen a double leg amputee, quote unquote walking, they're really just rotating their upper body and their lower body to raise and lower each side of the pelvis in order to make it so that they can sort of walk on the base of their pelvis. It's very, very fascinating. His theory has evolved over time to include these interconnected parts of our body called the slings. So he thought about these rotational movements. He called it the spinal engine. Now, over time, we realized there's definitely more interconnected slings that make up the body. These slings, they're made up of muscle tissue and connective tissue. So it's not just one or the other. The ligaments, tendons, all that fascia is all connected to that muscle. And then they're connected across different parts of the body. These slings are really, really good at producing and transmitting force. What they also do, too, and we're going to talk about this a lot when we talk about the two slings that we talk about today, is they help us control force, right? Effective sling training is going to make you more efficient and also significantly decrease your chance of injury. If we look at the body as this spinal engine, we look at it as this set of interconnected pieces. So if we only work in isolation, we're not going to work in the interconnected nature that the body works. We talked about core training last week, what it is and what it isn't. This is the direction your core training should be going, right? Working more with these sling systems, working using your body as an interconnected whole, not just, a sum of multiple parts. And a lot of the conversation today is going to be about rotation. Obviously, Russian twists are a rotational exercise. They are not an example of good sling training.
You really don't like Russian twists,
dude. Oh my God, no, I do not at all. And then some people hit me up when I, made the post about how I don't like Russian twists.
Mm-hmm.
Like, well, it can be a good, rotational endurance exercise. I'm like, I got 1,000 others. And then I posted like 6 different exercises on my story. I was like, this one, or this one, or this one. No, I don't like them.
Is it the Russian or the twist part?
I don't know.
You could have just said yes.
Yeah, yes.
So this sling theory, just to go into a little bit more detail, like you had touched on, John, is just a series of the interconnection between the muscles, the fascia, the ligaments, and the tendons that stretch from one part of the body to the other. So all these slings go from the upper body to the lower body. So from the head to the toe, there's this interconnection, and they all cross the pelvis. So the whole point of these slings are to help stabilize both the pelvis and the lumbar spine. But as you touched on earlier, help transmit forces across the pelvis from any upper body actions and lower body actions.
Yep. Yeah, like I said, this whole body is interconnected. For the spinal engine to be efficient and effective at its job, we need to make sure these slings are doing their job, right? So each of these slings has a role. However, each of the roles are connected to the other slings. So we can't have one sling picking up the slack of the other slings. This is going to cause dysfunction. This is going to cause pain. It's going to cause decrease in stability. So when all these slings are working in unison, when they work in harmony with one another, and obviously we're going to talk about only two of them today and then two of them next week, but you're really going to see that when we talk about gait, right, just walking, each of these slings has a role in walking, and they each have to be working optimally in order to make sure walking and running are effective movements. But when they work in harmony and they work in unison, these slings will help create stability and mobility through the spine and through the pelvis. So if you're wondering where all your mobility is, well, it could be being lost in the inefficiencies of your slings.
Yeah, and just to give you guys an idea of how much impact these slings actually have on the spine stability, there's a study that was performed that looked at just the spine in isolation, and it was estimated that before it begins to buckle, it can withstand forces up to 90 newtons. And so for people that don't know the conversion of newtons, 1 Newton force is equal to 0.225 pounds of pound force.
Mm-hmm.
So when you look at 90 newtons, that translates over to 20.2 pounds of force, which is not a whole lot if you think about it. And so again, they were looking at just the spine in isolation. So no muscles, no nerves, no connective tissues, no other joints. However, when you add in everything else, your body can withstand up to 1,500 newtons of force that can be transmitted through the body. So all of these structures around the spine and the pelvis assist in providing additional stability by allowing that increased amount of force to be dispersed.
Yeah. Yeah, and from this we have, four major slings. We have the anterior oblique sling. The NASM, National Academy of Sports Medicine, calls it the subsystem. And I worked underneath the NASM book for so long during my first job that sometimes I'll just accidentally say subsystem, so please correct me. I think sling, we call it the sling theory, so I think using sling is just a better term. Let's cut it down to the one. And then the posterior oblique sling, and then the deep longitudinal sling, and then the lateral sling. Again, today we're just going to be talking about two of the slings, and that is the anterior oblique sling and then the posterior oblique sling. These are the two slings that make this crisscross pattern across the front of your body. Obviously, the anterior oblique sling is the one that's crisscrossing across the front. And then the posterior oblique sling is crisscrossing across the back, and we'll talk about the specifics of each one of those two.
Yeah, so I made the analogy a while back talking about this anterior oblique sling. If you take a satchel or a purse and you throw it on, of course, I wear satchels because Indiana Jones wears one. And you have the strap going across the front. Picture that with your muscles and your fascia across your body. That's the direction of like what the sling would be looking like.
Yeah.
So again, the anterior oblique sling first that we're going to talk about is composed of your oblique muscles, so your external oblique, and then your opposite side internal oblique, as well as the opposite side adductor complex, so those muscles on the inner thigh. Okay, so all of these are connected by the adductor abdominal fascia. So for people that don't know what fascia is, just like ligaments and tendons, fascia is a fibrous connective tissue. It's made up of bundles of collagen fibers. And to get an idea of what fascia does and like what it is, imagine like you have a piece of meat and you take plastic wrap and you put it around the meat. Okay, that plastic wrap that covers the meat would be what fascia is. And so
That's a really good analogy. I had a way worse analogy in the blog.
What was yours?
It was just a tight shirt.
So one of the purposes that fascia serves is it helps reduce friction of muscular force. So obviously when muscles are contracting, they're shortening and they're potentially rubbing up against other structures. That prevents that friction from just rubbing on directly and wearing it down. But again, fascia also attaches, stabilizes, It encloses and separates muscles and other internal organs, including like your nerves and your blood vessels that pass through and between the muscles themselves. Unfortunately, while all this is great, there's very limited research on these aspects and properties of fascia. I know there's research that's been published about how like elastic fascia is and whether it's
Right.
elastic or not. There's questions of if this type of tissue actually has like contractile abilities, just like muscle tissue. Even effects of having like fascial adhesions affecting other parts of the body up and down the chain. A lot of this stuff is still very, very limited. And the only research that's been done has just been on dead bodies and pulling on stuff.
Yeah, and I think you're teaching me a little bit about fascia right now. Definitely is one of those things that people are thinking is going to be the future of biomechanics. It seems you look at some of the textbooks that get written now that are very theoretical, very hypothetical. Like if this were to be true, look at all the things that fascia does. As of right now, not really too sure. What we are sure though is it is a piece of connective tissue, right? It's going from one thing to the other, and it's going to help transmit those forces that these muscles are producing. Correct?
Right.
Yeah, and that's the thing that we want to be focused on mostly when we talk about the sling systems this week and next week. While we're walking, the anterior oblique sling is very, very important. Every one of the slings is very important when we look at human gait. Obviously, human gait, right, just the natural walking pattern, then translates to running, then translates to literally everything else we do. It all stems from those movements, I think. Right before you plant your subsystem sling, it's going to help rotate your pelvis forward, right? So on that trail leg, so you're stepping out with the one leg. On the trail leg, it's going to help rotate that pelvis forward. This is going to help optimize the body position over that stance leg and prepare you for the forces that it's about to meet on the ground. This is going to help improve the transfer of forces to help stabilize the trunk and the pelvis while you're walking.
Yeah, and like I had talked about with the satchel analogy, looking at just the fiber direction from this sling and how it crisscrosses in the front of the body, this means that this anterior oblique sling is very important in helping us rotate. So anything that has rotational aspects, like you said, walking, running, throwing, punching, swinging, pushing, all of these have rotational aspects and are going to utilize this anterior oblique sling.
Yep. When we look at how we train the AOS, right, the anterior oblique sling, and I want to talk about how this connects to the WEN system in a second. We didn't get a chance to talk about this before the podcast, but I want to tell you some of the ideas that I have about how we're going to use rotation and notate rotation. If we're looking at how we train the anterior oblique sling and the posterior oblique sling, this is going to be a very similar conversation for both of them. Rotational work. Obviously, we're looking at the crisscross of the pattern. Well, if I want to activate those muscles, I got to rotate, right? I got to rotate in the direction that they're going. So if I want to use rotation, we're going to talk about this more when we talk about the posterior oblique sling. The anterior oblique sling and the posterior oblique sling, right? The AOS and the POS are going to simultaneously be working. There's going to be one that's on, the opposite side's going to be on, and then the one side's going to be controlling the movement. But we want to try to target the one that's going to be the most dominant in that motion. The way we do that primarily is going to be through positions. And Kevin, if you have any other ideas, let me know. One of the ways that I really like to target the anterior oblique sling primarily is through a split position. I had a rotation of press exercise in the blog that the purpose of the exercise was to really target my anterior oblique sling, but of course, when I rotate, the posterior oblique sling is also working. The way that I truly targeted the AOS was by putting my front leg forward, right, facing perpendicular to the cable. That way, when I rotate across, the primary mover is that anterior oblique sling, pulling that, that left side of my body towards that right leg, and that right leg is pulling towards the left side of my body. If you have any other ways, Kevin, other than positionally of targeting the AOS, what do you think?
Yeah, I know there's a piece of equipment I'm a big fan on, I know other coaches are as well. I think it's called What's That Strap? And it's something that you can exchange out like a cable handle for, and you put it on, and it's just like this big, like yellow Velcro strap that you can like wrap yourself within. And so you can like put your arm through and then spin around. So it almost creates like a sling on you. And so then
Okay.
from there, you're able to do, you can either like use your pelvis or you can use your trunk. You can do rotational exercises off of a cable machine, just like rotating with your body. I know in my experience using it, I like it because it helps guys understand like feel. So like
Yeah, for sure.
what rotation is really supposed to feel like. It's not just like when you're swinging or throwing, it's not just like just your arm coming through. Like we want to feel rotation from coming like the middle part of our body rotating through something. It's not just our trunk is just stationary and our arm is just doing all the work.
Right.
But yeah, definitely also, like you said, like putting in like split stance positions to utilize the different biases towards one sling or the other.
When we once we're done discussing the posterior oblique sling, I want to talk about the specific split stance position that targets the AOS versus the POS, because I want to talk about how we're going to write that in the WEN system. But just like you were talking about, I want to talk about this because I think people find it interesting. You go to throw, something that'll be interesting is do some rotational training a lot, maybe like the week prior, and then go to throw a football and really focus on just rotating that trunk, along with the motion of your arm. You're going to notice how much less your arm does the work. I throw a decent amount of football, with some of my clients who I have to run routes with. And once I am really dialed into my rotation, my arm does way less work.
Yeah, like it's crazy. Like if you watch like some guys in slow motion, like if you go onto like Twitter or Instagram, you look up this guy's handle is Pitching Ninja. He posts like gifs of like these pitchers with nasty pitches, and we'll sometimes do like Slowmo mechanic breakdowns, and you can see just like how effortless like it looks, just like 100 miles an hour coming out of a guy's arm, when
Yep.
it's just like his arm is literally just going there for the ride, and everything is just trunk rotation and getting. Obviously, there's more that plays into it, like getting into your front leg and everything, but just like the ease that it looks like, holy cow, like anyone could pick up a ball and throw 100. But
Yeah.
obviously,
Speaking of throwing a ball, Tom Brady, Buccaneers, 4:30. You gonna watch?
he's not on my fantasy team, so I do not care.
Man.
I have Cam Newton.
Oh man,
That's not a
bad
slap in the
choice.
face.
Bad
Hey,
choice.
eighth
Dude.
round quarterback. That's not bad.
8th round, Cam
Yeah,
Newton
Cam Newton.
shows how much people think his potential is going to be in your fantasy
And
league.
then I've picked up Phillip Rivers in the 14th, so no pressure.
Oh. No pressure.
But yeah, back to the topic of slings. Like we both had touched on, these slings work. The anterior sling and the posterior sling, they work in harmony with each other. When any type of rotational action, like you said, one side is shortening while the other side is lengthening.
Yep.
They both aid in gait, which is walking, running. It's a rotational aspect. Talking about the pelvis and the shoulders rotating. But to highlight quickly what the posterior sling is made up of, it's made up of one of the muscles, the latissimus dorsi. So it's that big muscle on the side of your back.
You might know it as the lat.
Or the lat. And if you follow that fiber direction down, go into your low back, like right above your pelvis area, is known as the thoracolumbar fascia, which again is the same fascia that we talked about that's similar to the anterior sling. And that feeds directly into your glute max muscle. Mm-hmm. So it's the same idea, same premise as the anterior sling, but now it's different muscles, same direction, but same purpose. Helps transmit force and helps with rotation.
Exactly. Obviously, I've been talking a lot about walking and running when we talk about these slings, but we weren't always upright creatures. If we look back in our chimpanzee-like state, our structure was very different. I mean, fortunately, we get to actually look at chimpanzees and look at our, ancestors and be like, well, what did we once look like? What was our structure once like?
Theory. We gotta just throw that out there for the people. theory of evolution.
Okay, the theory of evolution.
Not, I'm just saying. You gotta please all the people.
All right, I'll try to please all the people. I'll try not to be so exclusive.
Factual. Yeah, be so factual. Stop it.
Thank you for saying that. I appreciate it. But if we look at chimpanzees, their glute max muscles are not very large. They spend a lot of the time on four limbs. They spend some time upright, but not a lot. However, the more and more upright we got, right, once we got to the point where we're now walking on 2 feet, bipedal primarily, the whole structure of our body changes. Now our glute max, which is part of that posterior oblique sling, is the largest muscle in our body. And it works hand in hand with that lat, right, that latissimus dorsi, to optimize our upright nature.
Yeah, so this posterior oblique sling helps create extension through your hip and upper body through the stance phase of gait. Okay, so when you're looking at running and walking, getting into that extension is what helps propel us going forward. And so looking at the lat, when it's in extension, it helps develop tension across the TLF, the thoracolumbar fascia, to stabilize the lumbar spine and pelvis. The posterior oblique sling helps control movement eccentrically when it's not concentrically contracting. So again, back to that idea of even though it's not shortening, it's still on doing something.
Exactly. We're going to talk about how all this sort of works harmoniously more next week. So definitely tune in for that. I think the blog I wrote for next week is a really fascinating one, really diving deep into lower back pain and some of the structures at the sacrum and the pelvis. It's definitely going to be a very good conversation, just talking about how all this transmitting of forces really optimizes all of those passive structures. But when we're trying to train the POS, right, the posterior oblique sling, we also are still going to do it through positions, right? So rotational split stances, with external rotation extension dominance are going to be, our goal. If we're trying to really work the posterior oblique sling, then we have to change that stance from an anterior oblique sling dominant stance to a posterior oblique sling dominant stance. But like you said, AOS and POS, they work in harmony. As one creates motion, the other's controlling that motion. And
that.
we have to talk.
Ooh, that was big. I like that.
Should I say it again for the people?
Do it again.
As one sling works to create motion, the other works to control that motion. So if you want to know why these slings are so important, it's because they're always working, and they're always working in tandem to try to optimize the other one. And then if they're not working in harmony, what happens when they're dysfunctional? But before we get into that, I want to talk about AOS and POS stances and AOS and POS rotation and how they're different and how we're going to notate them. This is going to be a little off the cuff, but when you think about notating in the WEN system, I've alluded to a little bit of the ideas that I've had up to this point. I've talked about if we're going to do AOS and POS rotation, most of it's going to be notated through stances, right? AOS split stance versus POS split stance. Do you have anything else to add to that? I have another thing I need to add as well, but do you have anything how we're going to notate those?
Not at this point. I think we'll have to get Nate on the phone and just have like a group discussion. But I do like the ideas that you brought up. But yeah, I mean, I would agree. I don't have anything new to add to it.
Yep. So the way it's going to work at the moment, and this is going to change. There's two pieces to this puzzle. As of now, the primary way I've been writing AOS split stance versus POS split stance is I've been writing them before the body position to notate what dominance the rotation is going to have. In the split stance itself, if I'm in an AOS split stance and I'm facing perpendicular to my cable, right? So my cable's off to my left side, and I'm facing perpendicular to it, and I'm going to rotate so the cable's pulling across my body. If I'm in an AOS split stance, my outside leg is going to be forward while my inside leg is back. That means that external oblique is contracting towards that adductor and that front side leg, and that adductor is pulling towards that oblique, right? So we're getting that contraction of that AOS. If I want to work in a posterior oblique sling, split stance, all I have to do is switch the feet. So the inside leg goes forward, back, front side leg goes back, and now it's more external rotation and extension of that external rotation of that lower body, extension of that lower body, and then extension of that upper body with that, lat on that back side. However, go for it.
I was gonna say, just like quick thought, we might be able to use this as just like a qualifier. So keeping it as, and just like another idea to throw out there. So keep it as like split stance, but then in the qualifier, have the bias of which sling we want to work on.
I definitely think that's the better way to approach it. I've been writing it as a like AOS split stance, but I think it'd be better to do as a qualifier. And here's why I think you're right, because now the next thing I was going to say was I was doing this one exercise, and you might have seen something similar. It's, if you can think of it, Vernon Griffiths does this exercise where he's in like a single leg bent position, has a kettlebell, hanging in this low goblet hold, and he rotates up to one side, right?
Yeah.
However, if let's say I'm in this single leg bent position and I rotate, my right leg's forward and then I rotate to my left. Well, that's going to be more POS dominant, right?
Mm-hmm.
However, I'm not in a POS stance. I'm in this stance. And I could also go and rotate to my right, and then it's going to be an AOS stance. So I think you're right in moments where the stance isn't going to be qualified by, AOS or POS. That's when we qualify the movement with AOS and POS, because you could be in this stance with the kettlebell now and go either way. And now it's a part of the movement, not the stance.
Exactly.
So I think you're 100% right. I think that helps clear up my thoughts on it quite a lot. So you can go on your next little section here.
All right, green part. Back to talking about what happens if one of these slings are dysfunctional. Again, these two work together, so if one's not working right, now we got a problem. And unfortunately, one of the most common problems that we see with people is low back pain. A lot of people have it and they complain about it, but unfortunately, not all lower back pain is created equal. There's some instances where it's caused by constant misuse. So an example might be just doing too many, obviously you'd have to do like thousands of them, but crunches, just like the repetitive lumbar flexion, just the nature over and over again. But other forms of low back pain could actually be caused by injuries elsewhere that cause the misuse injury to happen in your low back. So something that's touched on sometimes is like having weak glutes. So now you're not able to stabilize the pelvis. So now other muscles have to pick up for that. And now you're getting like your QL is getting all knotted up and you're getting low back pain because the glute can't hold up the pelvis anymore, can't stabilize it. So again, although it may be present, if you look at two people and they both say they have back pain, the cause of it from person to person may be different.
Yeah, and I've definitely been noticing that. I've had a few clients, I have to admit, because I work with most of my personal training clientele is general population, right? People in their 40s, 50s, 60s, and they all have some form of lower back pain. When I do the evals on them, everybody's presenting different movements. So I can't treat them all the same. I can't be like, well, Sally, John, and Larry have lower back pain. Let me just give them my low back pain protocol. No, there's different slings that are working and not working, and different slings that are compensating or not that are causing their low back pain. It's presenting the same way. It's in the same area. We're going to talk about next week why it keeps presenting in this area, but the actual root cause of it is completely different.
Yeah.
Do you have a lot of athletes that complain about low back pain in the professional setting?
Yeah, definitely in baseball, you get it's very prevalent, like low back pain and like pars fractures, just because of it's always like extension and rotation. So you get a lot of like lumbar low back pain on top of a lot of kids don't know how to shift their weight back and walk like normal people. So they're walking on their toes and their pelvis is anteriorly tilted. So now they're cranking even more extension in that low back. Yeah, it's definitely I wouldn't say a very common thing, but of the people, of the issues that we see, it is one of the top issues.
Because I imagine with a lot of my people, it's a underuse issue which ends up leading to compensations and misuse. For you, it's going to be a lot of overuse, which is going to lead to a lot of misuse in some other areas, right?
Yeah, I would say like overuse of improper use. Like,
Yeah.
if that makes sense. Like
No, that makes perfect sense.
they're not moving effectively and efficiently, and they're doing it multiple times. And so that's where they're
Yeah.
getting the issues.
So when we talk about lower back pain, and this is definitely what I see consistently with all of the people that I train who have these different, who have the same presentation of pain, but different presentation of movement, is their deep muscles, like their transversus, right? That corset type muscle that's wrapping around those deep intrinsic core muscles are dysfunctional. So yeah, sure, they're presenting different movement dysfunctions, but time and time again, I'm seeing everybody's not able to use their transversus, not able to breathe diaphragmatically. You could probably even make a good case that some of the other muscles that we'll talk about next week, like the multifidus, is, just as dysfunctional from each of those people, regardless of their presentation of, sling dysfunction. So deep muscles, most of the time, this is almost going to be always true, are going to be dysfunctional with anybody with lower back pain. But like I said, they'll present differently as far as their movement's concerned, although the pain's presenting the same. Then you have to talk about, the dysfunction at which sling's working too much, which sling's not working enough, and how am I going to treat this person as an individual versus just, okay, their deep muscles aren't working just like everybody else. I'm just going to give them this breathing protocol and they'll be good to go.
Yeah, it's definitely not a cookie cutter. Like you said, it's not like, oh, you got back pain here, do this, and you'll be fine. Yeah. It's definitely go ahead.
Well, I was going to say, I thought it was. I thought low back pain was just get them into more posterior pelvic tilt, get their pelvis neutral, strengthen their core, strengthen their, extensors, and they'll be good to go. But it's not that. It is not that. In this article and the research I've been doing the past couple of weeks has really been very enlightening for me.
So dysfunction again at either this anterior sling or this posterior sling, because it can cause low back pain if one of these aren't working correctly. But unfortunately, a lot of people try to solve their low back pain thinking that, oh, it's like you brought up, like, oh, I need to strengthen my core, or I need to work on posteriorly tilting my pelvis. They do it the wrong way. They sit there and they do a bunch of crunches, or if they feel their muscles are tight, they'll sit there and stretch it, or they'll even go outside the scoping, go see like chiropractors and try to have them adjust their low backs and everything. But the problem with this approach is it doesn't appreciate the body as a whole, like as a system, like we talked on, like right in the beginning of the show. It's a series of complex systems all working together.
I don't want to say too much bad about chiropractors. I have worked with plenty of good ones. I know plenty of good ones, ones that have helped me out personally. The biggest issue I see sometimes is how infrequently they refer out to trainers and physical therapists. Obviously everybody wants the business to themselves. If they're going to refer out to somebody who's going to solve the problem for good, then that person's not going to come back to them. Which I completely understand from a business perspective. When we look at it from, the human perspective, trying to really help people, they should understand that everybody should understand the body works interconnected, and just going through and doing manual manipulation of somebody's spine or somebody's joints is not going to solve the problem if the problem is movement, and that movement is dysfunctional, and that dysfunction is pulling on the spine in all sorts of ways that are causing that malalignment. Have you had any problems with, physical therapists, chiropractors, anybody who just like thinks of things in isolation like this?
I think that gets into a sticky situation of like, obviously you look at like PT and PT people where it's like, okay, a patient comes in, they complain of like low back pain, and all of a sudden they're sitting here doing exercises like away from the low back. And so obviously the client or the patient is like, my low back is hurting. What am I doing this for? But then two, sometimes like the insurance companies, like you have to justify why you're doing the stuff. And so if they don't see it as like, oh, you're not treating the low back, like gone. So it's definitely like a gray, sketchy area. But a good analogy I like to use is like, if you have bad movement, think of this as like your axles on your car are off. And so you have to sit there and keep going to get your tires changed and tires rotating. You're like, I don't know why my tires keep wearing down like this. This is like an issue. It's not the tires that's causing the issue. It's the malalignment that they're on.
Right.
That's what's causing them to go out so fast or go out improperly. Like if you don't
Yeah, and you keep
fix,
changing the tires. You go from Goodrich to Michelin and back and forth, and you're like, why is this still happening? You don't
yeah,
fix the problem.
you're putting a Band-Aid on a stab wound. Like you're not going to have it. There's going to come a point where it's like, all right, the Band-Aid's not working anymore. You got to put a new Band-Aid on. Got to put a new Band-Aid on. And it's like, you have to address the root problem.
I love your analogy. Yeah, I think the tire analogy is perfect. It's like, why are my tires wearing? Why are they wearing in this uneven pattern? Well, it's the alignment of your car, not the tires themselves. That was a really good one. I think we should end it there because we're going to talk a lot more about low back pain, how to solve low back pain, the other two sling system, which is the deep longitudinal system, then the lateral sling. I posted the blog already. I'm actually going to probably announce it in a couple hours here. So, Kevin, if you want to go check it out. But apart from that, that is the anterior oblique sling and the posterior oblique sling. Anything else?
Thanks for listening.